The RELLANA'S Cameo talisman has gotten so much better since the recent patch. It actually does boost the damage of stance-based skills when you do hold onto the stance for a second. Now the buff actually went from a 1.5 second charge time to a 1 second charge time, which doesn't seem like much, but that literally is a 50% increase, and half a second makes so much difference in so many different boss fights. It feels like with almost every single opening now with the boss, I can just get this thing fully charged and its benefit of now 45% more damage from the 15% it used to be. So it basically went from a B tier talisman that was somewhat situational to an S tier talisman that you're now going to be benefiting of a lot of times. Even if you only benefit of the skill like 30% of the time, that's still 15% more damage, which is just as much as the Shard of Alexander. So it's to the point now that if you have a stance-based skill, I would just have this on at all times, like no matter what. This is just the best talisman to pair alongside your build. Now, as I mentioned, it still is going to be situational. There are some cases and some bosses, especially in the DLC, that don't really give you an opening long enough to get your stance skill fully charged, especially if you are using the ones that have longer animations like the Sword of Night and Flame or the RELLANA'S Twin Blades. And also, if you do have an opening that lasts a few seconds, and if you are using quicker types of skills, like Unsheath or Moonveil for instance, you're probably better off just using the skill twice without having to wait for it to be charged, more so than just using one charge attack, because obviously using the skill twice is 100% more damage, and it's going to do twice as much stance damage too. Now, it's obviously not going to be anywhere near as FP efficient, but so many of these skills are really cheap for how much damage that they do, that it's not that big of a deal anyway. But in almost every other instance and situation of the game, you're just going to be better off just fully charging the skill, because all you got to do is just count to a second, which is very easy to predict, and you can just maximize your damage output so easily. Now, being that this thing has been changed, I might as well go ahead and rank all of the different stances from worst to best, all 7 of them. Now, every single one of these are really good, and the top 5 are like S tier options. Even before the update, they were S tier. So don't really focus too much on how I'm ranking them. Just focus more on what I'm saying about these different skills, because I do have a lot of opinions on all of them. Now, to start off with, I want to talk about overhead stance, to what I consider the worst of all these stance types of skills. But that's not to say that it's useless or bad at all, hence it still being an A tier. The skill does give you the option of one quick downward swipe or just a triple swing. And I think my biggest overall issue with this skill is that it just lacks the stance damage. All of the other different types of skills offer you a high stance damaging option that's really quick and cheap, which these are really quick and they're cheap, but the light attack version only does 11 stance damage and the heavy attack version does 22 stance damage, which for comparison, the Unsheath heavy attack does 30 stance damage, and that's just in one swing. Now, when you do pair this alongside the RELLANA'S Cameo talisman, it actually does become probably the best damaging option out of all the Ashes of War paired alongside a Great Katana, because that triple swing attack can be very nice and actually also proc bleed pretty quickly. The light attack version is kind of just there if you only have like a small opening, but in that instance, you could just use like your light attacks instead, because they're just going to be doing more stance damage. I kind of wish instead of this attack, it just had like a high damaging stance attack instead. That would have made this stance a lot more versatile. Now, I think the best overall Ash of War for these Great Katanas are going to be things like Repeating Thrust and Blood Tax. Now, when you do have overhead stance fully charged, that triple swinging attack is actually going to do more damage than Blood Tax and Repeating Thrust, but it obviously is going to have a longer animation if you do include that fully charged effect. And things like Blood Tax and Repeating Thrust are going to proc bleed faster, and for specifically Blood Tax, it's going to give you health regen, and these are going to do piercing damage as well. So in a lot of different situations in the game, whether you're trading out with enemies or fighting enemies weaker to piercing damage, these skills could potentially just outdamage overhead stance, even with the RELLANA'S Cameo. Especially if you have the Arns box set equipped alongside Blood Tax. This could just work better, lunge further, and even stun lock a bit better as well. So although it still is an amazing option for the Great Katanas, it is lacking a stance breaking option, and I still think it's outclassed by these poking attack types of skills. Moon and Fire stance off the RELLANA'S has actually received multiple different buffs as of this recent patch, and it is in a much better position as it once was. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, as I did just make a video a couple days ago going in depth, but I do think this skill in both the fire and the magic based version complement each other perfectly. And now as of the recent patch, they both do higher amounts of stance damage and just do really nice damage overall. Now, the main reason why it's going to get this low is because I think this Sword of Night and Flame still outclasses it. It might not do as much total overall damage, but the skill of the Sword of Night and Flame are just going to be much faster if you do compare them to the entire combos of the RELLANA'S Twin Blades. And it's to the point that the Sword of Night and Flame just results in much higher DPS, and it's just much more consistent in my opinion. And also combined with the fact that it gets better faith and intelligence based scaling, it's just easier to get maximum amounts of damage. But the RELLANA'S Twin Blades does do a few things better than the Sword of Night and Flame. The magic based version obviously does split up the damage in increments because there are multiple different parts to the skill. So if you have like a shorter opening and you try to hit enemies at a distance, you can just quickly use the magic version, hit them a couple of times, and it's just going to do some nice damage for not that much FP. Whereas for the Sword of Night and Flame, the magic version can't do that. You get stuck in that animation. And also with all these consecutive hits, it is going to be easier to hit targets that move around. and it could potentially stun lock smaller enemies too. Now, as for the fire-based version, I think this one is just really good at stun locking. When you're fighting those smaller enemies or groups of those enemies, they can all get staggered and just get caught up in that massive tornado attack. But the entire animation is way longer than the Sword of Night and Flame version, and the Sword of Night and Flame version just goes way further, and it's just going to be much more consistent, but the stance damage of the RELLANA'S Twin Blades can be a lot higher, so it still does have its uses. I think one change that I would like to see about the RELLANA'S Twin Blades is to have these skills work with the multi-hit talismans, because they do have hitboxes with their weapons directly if you use them at closer ranges, but for some reason it just doesn't proc the talismans, because the light greatswords already have good synergy with them, so it would be nice if the skills could work too, and also it would be pretty cool if the heavy attack portion did have some more hyper armor, but overall these weapons are in a much better spot, and I consider them to be very viable. At number 5, Unsheath, which is a skill specific to the katanas. And at this point, every single one of these skills are just S tier. Somebody could put Unsheath at number 1 and I wouldn't really argue with it much. This skill is really fast, incredibly cheap, does high stance damage, and it staggers pretty well too. And obviously now with the RELLANA'S Cameo, it can just get even more damage. Now, as I mentioned before, in some cases when you have longer openings, it's probably just better to just constantly spam this skill over and over again, because in the time that it takes to fully charge it, sometimes you might only get one attack off compared to just using the skill twice, and obviously using the skill twice is twice as much damage and twice as much stance damage compared to just a 40% damage boost. So before this update, I would have put Unsheath a lot higher, but since the update, I'm going to put it a bit lower because Unsheath benefits the least out of the RELLANA'S Cameo compared to all the other skills. It obviously still benefits greatly, but just not as much in my opinion. But any single time I am using a katana, Unsheath is probably going to be the option I'm using most of the time, because there's no other skills offered to the katanas that could do this much damage and this much stance damage in such a little amount of time for such little FP. Like the heavy attack portion can do 30 stance damage, and that comes at basically instantly. Unfortunately, the light attack version is only 15 stance damage, but the speed differences aren't that noticeable. But I think the best part about the Unsheath skill is that it's very easy to cancel the recovery animation. You can just crouch after every single use and just constantly use it over and over again. Number 4, Transient Moonlight of the Moonveil Katana. Now, before the updates, I would have considered the Unsheath skill to be better than the Transient Moonlight skill, but since the changes to the RELLANA'S Cameo Talisman, I think the Moonveil is just now better. Now, Unsheath can just literally do more damage than Transient Moonlight. If you have a Magic Infused Uchi Katana or Nagakiba, it's just going to do more damage for like a third of the FP cost. But there are going to be a few reasons why I do prefer Moonveil Katana. That's one, it does get a projectile attack, and projectiles just cheese the game. You can just sit at safer distances and just pick enemies off at a distance, and the projectile just travels so fast and just does a lot of damage. And the range of the skill is like deceptively large. People think it's only like Rivers of Blood types of range, but no, this thing just shoots out very far. And projectiles are going to have much better synergy with the RELLANA'S Cameo as well, because you can just fully charge it in a safe spot. Whereas for using things like Unsheath, if you wanted to fully charge it and benefit off RELLANA'S Cameo, you have to be right next to the enemy, where you're in danger of them hitting you and staggering you out of the attack. So that's going to be like one of the reasons why I prefer the Moonveil, because the projectile attack just gets amazing synergy. But as I did mention before, if you are at these closer ranges and using like the Unsheath skill, sometimes you just benefit more of just using the skill twice, more so for than just waiting for the attack to charge up and only just use it once. And in that instance, you could just use like the light attack version twice. Now for the Unsheath skill, the light attack you didn't really benefit much because it does like half the amount of stance damage as the heavy attack, and it's not that much difference in speed. But for the Moonveil light attack, this actually does 27.5 stance damage, which is almost twice as much as the Unsheath skill. And with how fast this skill comes out, and combined with like the crouching canceling, just crouch after every single use, you can just spam this thing over and over again, and it could just output some of the highest like stance DPS in the game. It could stance break really quickly with just constant spamming. So that's going to be the major reasons why I do prefer Moonveil, but that's not to say that it's without any downsides. One, it is a lot more expensive than Unsheath and some of the other types of stance skills. Two, you obviously are limited to just an intelligence-based build. Obviously, Unsheath can be paired alongside many different types of builds. And also, being that the attack is split up into two parts, the magic projectile doing half the stance damage and the weapon model itself doing half the stance damage. Sometimes you could like stance break with just the magic projectile, and then the weapon hitbox can actually stagger them out of the stance break. There's very few circumstances where that happens, but that is something you also got to keep an eye out for. Number 3, Square Off. Now this thing is just stupid. Like it just makes every single straight sword just like an S tier option, because not only can this thing just do really high amounts of damage and just really high amounts of stance damage, but it costs like next to no stamina and like no FP. The light attack version costs 6 FP and does 30 stance damage in such a quick animation, and the heavy attack version does 40 stance damage for only 8 FP. 40 stance damage is more than a Colossal Sword charged heavy attack. Like, it's just stupid. Now, the heavy attack version is going to have like a longer animation, and unfortunately you can't really cancel the recovery frames like you can with Unsheath. But in that instance, you could just use the light attack because the light attack is much faster and does 30 stance damage, which is more than enough. But when you do have those longer openings, you could just use the heavy attack version. And it actually does lunge in pretty far. So there's plenty of times where you can just like wait for an enemy's combo to finish and just charge it up in the meantime. And then it just like lunges right towards the enemy as they finish. And then you just benefit off the 45% more damage off the RELLANA'S Cameo, benefit of 40 stance damage, and it's doing piercing damage too, which is another underrated part about this. So yeah, it's like not going to be the most flashy skill by any means. And it's probably not going to be the highest damaging one either. Like you could still just get more damage out of things like Unsheath. But in terms of its versatility, its synergy with the RELLANA'S Cameo, and there's a total overall stance damage that it can do, Square offers just one of the more premium Ashes of War in this game. Number 2, Wing Stance, which I don't think there is a single skill that actually benefits more off the RELLANA'S Cameo than this one. Like seriously, out of all the stance-based skills, this one benefits the most, and obviously now the RELLANA'S Cameo has gotten buffed by a whole bunch. I think this one is like the most improved out of all the stance-based skills. It still wasn't S tier before the patch, but I probably would have put it around about number 5. But now I think it definitely sits comfortably higher up, and I will explain why. Now, Wing Stance does give you the option of either a 3-hit swiping attack or a lunging attack. Now, this light attack does do roughly 16 stance damage, and the heavy attack actually does do 30 stance damage. And I think both of these things just complement each other so well. Typically with light greatswords, you don't really have the option to like stagger those larger enemies like knights or omens as well. But this light attack version is just gonna stun lock them, and you can just combo the skill back and forth. You can just continuously spam it over and over again. And the best part about this is that as long as you're holding onto the skill and continuously using this light attack combo, you're gonna benefit off the RELLANA'S Cameo. As long as you had it fully charged beforehand, this whole combo is gonna get 45% more damage as long as you just continue swinging. And you can actually combo in the heavy attack afterwards, and this entire combo, once again, just 45% more damage. Now, any single time where you're fighting enemies that can't be staggered easily, you're probably not going to really benefit of like spamming the light attack over and over again. But that's where the heavy attack comes into play, because this thing is obviously, as I mentioned, doing over 30 stance damage, going to be doing piercing damage, only costs 10 FP, and best of all yet, it lunges very far. And you can kind of treat this like you can with like the Moonveil Katana. And as I mentioned with that one, it has great synergy with the RELLANA'S Cameo because you can just fully charge it when you're in like a safe spot, and it's like lunge in towards the enemy after it's fully charged. Because maybe with like the light attack versions, it's going to be a bit more risky because you have to be a bit closer. And in that second of charging up the stance, you might end up getting staggered or hit out of it. But this lunging heavy attack is just free basically. There's plenty of bosses that are like just stand idle at a certain distance. They don't really attack or hit you at all. So you can just sit back, charge up the skill, and just benefit off just so much more damage with every single lunge. It's actually kind of crazy. And that's number 1, the Knight in Flame stance of the Sword of Knight in Flame. Now, as I mentioned with the RELLANA'S Twin Blades, this skill performs very similar as it does have a fire and a magic-based version. Although this one I am going to prefer because it just has better scalings with this weapon. So it can just get higher amounts of damage, especially at these higher levels. And then it's going to be much easier to use as they're both just nice projectile options that just come out in one hit. You don't have to wait for like an entire combo just to benefit off major damage. Now, I don't think the synergy between both the magic and the fire version are going to be as good as like the RELLANA'S Twin Blades because there isn't really like a good quick damaging option. Both of them still have somewhat of a longer animation and don't benefit of any hyper armor. But you still have one that's good for single targets, and you still have one that's good for an AoE and that fire attack. And obviously you are doing different types of damage, and there are plenty of enemies that are like weaker to fire damage or resist to fire damage. So you're going to be alternating between the both anyway. But the main reason why it gets number 1 is because it just gets stupid damage. Like the damage is just absurd. And especially now with the RELLANA'S Cameo, like you're just doing 40% more damage for only charging it up for a second. And as I mentioned, with projectile attacks, you're just going to benefit way more off of the RELLANA'S Cameo because you can just charge it up in safety, not have to really be close to an enemy at all. Now, you still benefit of more damage when hitting with the weapon directly, but this thing is still just OP even at a distance as well. Like, as long as you just create distance, like every single enemy is just destroyed. Now, against a lot of DLC bosses that don't really give you longer openings and that are really aggressive, you're probably not going to get the entire combo off. You might have to get pretty lucky or just use specific types of openings to just land the entire combo. So it's not going to be something that you use on every single opening that you have. But all you got to do is just land this attack a couple of times and you're just going to win every single engagement. And if you're using things like Spirit Ashes to distract bosses, it's just not even going to be close. Like, this thing is going to be one of the best weapons in the entire game. Easy top 5 weapon at this point as well. And I think best of all yet, you can get this weapon without having to kill a single boss. Just like run all the way to the carry mana, pick it up, then you have one of the best weapons in the game and the best faith/intelligence weapon too. Anyway, that is that now done and completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. If I did miss anything, just discuss it down there. As for the next video, I probably want to give like my overall thoughts on the patch. I kind of just did cover most of the things that I want to anyway, but there still are a few things that I can still talk about. So if that does interest you, just please let me know. But yeah, thanks for watching and catch you guys around. Bye.